The 911 call came at 4:23 p.m. on July 10, 2019. Zara Jackson's mother, Olivia Carter, had just hung up the phone, her hands shaking. Her daughter had said something she could barely comprehend. "We left her in God's hands." That was all it took. She dialed 911 immediately. Told them her granddaughter, a 9-month-old baby, had been left alone for 10 days. By the time officers arrived, the house in suburban Atlanta was silent. The blinds were closed, the front door locked. But the air outside carried a faint, sickly odor. They forced entry. Inside the small nursery, they found her. Zoe Jackson, 9 months old. She had been gone for at least a day, her tiny body still in the crib where her parents had left her. There were no signs of struggle, just the unmistakable evidence of slow, torturous neglect. Her parents, Will and Zara Jackson, were still thousands of miles away, attending a church conference, praying for a miracle. But God wasn't watching over Zoe anymore. This should have never happened. Zoe Jackson wasn't abandoned on the streets. She wasn't lost in a system that failed her. She was left to die in her own home by the people who were supposed to love her the most. No child should suffer like this. No one should turn their faith into something so blind, so cruel, that it justifies neglect. If cases like this matter to you, if you believe that no story should go unheard, subscribe to True Crimes Corner. Because every victim deserves to be remembered. For anyone who knew them, Will and Zara Jackson were the couple every church admired. They had been together since high school, two devoted believers who never missed a Sunday service. When they married in 2015, their church celebrated them as an example of faith and commitment. Everything about them seemed perfect. But beneath the surface, there was a pain neither of them could pray away. For years, Zara struggled to conceive. Every negative pregnancy test, every failed attempt, felt like a betrayal from God. Will, an only child, had grown up watching his mother raise 6 children with another man. He had dreamed of fatherhood since he was young. Zara, the youngest of 5, had always pictured a house filled with children. They did everything they could. Doctors, fertility specialists, prayers at the altar, fasting. Nothing worked. Each year that passed without a baby was another wound to their faith. And then, in 2018, their prayers were answered. Zara was finally pregnant. The news spread quickly in their church. People called it a miracle, a testimony of patience and faith. The couple's joy was unmatched. They prepared for their baby with a level of devotion that went beyond excitement. It was obsession. They watched children's shows like Cocomelon and Little Baby Bum, imagining the day they could sing along with their child. They decorated the nursery months in advance, buying clothes, toys, books, everything Zoe could ever need. They prayed over her crib every night, thanking God for the blessing He had given them. And then, Zoe was born. 9 months of hope turned into a lifetime of devastation. Zoe had been born with lissencephaly, a rare brain disorder that affects motor function, muscle tone, and development. The diagnosis was crushing. She would never walk, never speak, never function like other children. For the first time in their lives, Will and Zara didn't thank God. Will couldn't even look at her. The excitement he once had for fatherhood collapsed the moment he heard the words neurological disorder. This wasn't the baby he had prayed for. Zara tried, at first. She tried to love Zoe, to remind herself that this was still the child she had begged God for. But Will's bitterness poisoned them both. Every time Zoe cried in the middle of the night, Will would mutter under his breath about how normal babies should be sleeping by now. Every time Zara tried to comfort her, he would shake his head, asking why God would give them a child who couldn't even recognize their faces. The nursery they once prayed over became a place of silent resentment. Church members started noticing the change. Will, once an outspoken man of faith, stopped giving testimonies. Zara, who had once led women's Bible studies, pulled away from everyone. Then came the moment that changed everything. Their church nominated them to attend the Lagos Miracle Conference. It was a prestigious event. Thousands of believers gathered from around the world seeking divine breakthroughs. When they got the invitation, Zara hesitated. The conference was 10 days long. Zoe was still a baby. She would need care. Zara suggested calling her mother, Olivia. Maybe she could watch Zoe. Maybe they could even take her along. But Will had a different idea. What if we leave her here and ask God to watch over her? The words were calm, deliberate. It wasn't just a question. It was a test. If she survives, then we know God wants us to have her, he said. If not, then maybe she wasn't really meant to be ours. Zara didn't argue. She didn't fight back. She just let go. On July 1st, 2019, just before sunrise, Zara Jackson walked into her daughter's nursery one last time. What happened inside that room during those final moments could never be fully known. There were no cameras, no witnesses, no way to tell if she hesitated or if she looked back before closing the door. But what was certain was that by 5:45 a.m., she and her husband, Will Jackson, had left the house. Their bags were packed, their flights booked. By 5:46 a.m., their 9-month-old daughter, Zoe Jackson, was alone. The house remained silent as they pulled out of the driveway. No family had been called. No neighbors had been notified. The front door locked behind them, leaving Zoe in a crib with nothing but an empty room and time. In the hours that followed, Zoe's absence from her parents' routine went unnoticed. Neighbors later reported that nothing seemed unusual that morning. The blinds in the Jacksons' home remained drawn, the car missing from the driveway. A few residents recalled hearing faint cries coming from inside during the day, but it wasn't uncommon for a baby to cry. No one thought to check. Inside, medical experts would later determine Zoe had gone the first few hours without distress. Infants can sustain themselves for a limited time without immediate nourishment, but by midday, her body had begun feeling the effects of hunger. By nightfall, the dehydration process had started. The temperature inside the house rose as the Georgia summer heat intensified. Investigators later noted that with the home sealed shut, airflow was minimal. The recorded temperature in Atlanta that week was in the high 80s, with humidity trapping heat inside. The conditions would have accelerated Zoe's decline. By day 2, Zoe's condition had worsened. According to medical findings, infants in distress from prolonged dehydration experience muscle contractions, dry mouth, and, eventually, lethargy. She would have had limited energy to cry, her body entering survival mode. Investigators pieced together details based on forensic evidence. The crib sheets, when discovered, were soaked with urine and sweat, indications that the infant had spent hours in discomfort, with no relief. At some point, Zoe had stopped making noise altogether. The neighbors who had initially heard faint crying reported that by the third day, the house was silent. No one knocked. No one knew. While Zoe lay trapped in a silent home, her parents had arrived in Lagos. Church members greeted them at the airport, their trip marked by excitement and spiritual expectation. They had been invited to the Lagos Miracle Conference, a gathering where believers from around the world came seeking divine intervention. According to testimonies from attendees, the Jacksons appeared deeply immersed in prayer and worship. Social media posts from that day showed Zara smiling in a group photo with other parishioners, the caption reading, "Expecting a miracle." There was no mention of Zoe, no calls made to check on her well-being, no signs of worry. For 10 days, Atlanta's summer heat bore down on an empty house, where a 9-month-old waited for parents who would not return in time. By July 5, 2019, Atlanta's summer heat had intensified. Outside, life moved on. The sounds of lawn mowers, passing cars, and children playing in the neighborhood filled the air. Inside the Jackson home, there was nothing but silence. By this point, Zoe Jackson's body had begun shutting down. Autopsy reports later revealed that by day 5, Zoe had slipped into a semi-conscious state. The severe dehydration had caused extreme muscle stiffness, her body no longer able to move freely. Dry, cracked lips and sunken eyes. Signs of advanced fluid loss. Weak pulse. Shallow breathing. The final stages of organ failure. By day 6, her body had stopped producing tears. By day 7, she no longer had the energy to cry. By day 8, her body gave up. Forensic analysis estimated Zoe Jackson died sometime between July 8th and 9th. No one knew the exact hour. She had spent the last 3 days of her life in complete silence. As the days passed, the Jackson home remained untouched. Neighbors went about their routines. No one knocked on the door. No one reported anything unusual. It wasn't until later that investigators realized a smell had begun creeping out of the house. One neighbor later recalled that by July 9th, a strange odor had started lingering near the Jacksons' front door. But no one thought much of it. The house stayed locked. The secret remained inside. And the people who had left her there? They were still in Nigeria. By July 10th, 2019, Zara Jackson's mother, Olivia, hadn't heard from her daughter in days. This wasn't unusual. Zara often got lost in church commitments, sometimes going days without checking in. But something about this time felt different. Olivia had been scrolling through Facebook when she saw it. A post from Zara. A photo of her and Will, standing in front of the Lagos Miracle Conference banner, both smiling. The caption read, "When God is about to bless you, the devil tries to test you." She didn't think much of the words, but something nagged at her. Where was Zoe? At 4:12 p.m., Olivia finally decided to call Zara. It rang twice before Zara answered, her voice light, filled with excitement. She talked about the conference, the powerful testimonies, the miracles people had received. Then Olivia asked, "Where's Zoe?" A long pause. Then Zara laughed softly. "She's home," she said. "We left her in God's hands." The words didn't register at first. Zara, still unfazed, explained calmly. They had left Zoe at home, locked inside, trusting God to protect her. If He wanted us to have her, she said, He would keep her safe. Olivia's hands went numb. She didn't wait to hear more. She hung up and called 911. The emergency dispatch received the call at 4:23 p.m. Units were sent immediately to the Jackson home. At 4:39 p.m., the first officer arrived. When no one answered the door, he checked the windows. All closed. The house was locked, but a faint smell lingered near the front steps. At 4:45 p.m., backup arrived. Officers forced entry. Nothing could have prepared them for what they found. The house was still. In the nursery, the air was suffocating. The odor hit them first. Thick, sour, undeniable. And then they saw her. Zoe Jackson, 9 months old, lifeless in her crib. The room told a story of suffering, a soiled blanket, an overturned empty bottle, faint scratch marks on the wooden crib rails. But Zoe's body told the worst part. One officer stepped back, swallowing hard. No one spoke. Then one of them radioed in. We need homicide detectives here. Now. By 5:15 p.m. on July 10th, 2019, homicide detectives had arrived at the Jackson home. The crime scene was sealed off, and forensic units began their work. The lead investigator later described the scene as one of the most disturbing cases of neglect he had ever witnessed. The medical examiner arrived shortly after detectives. Zoe's body was examined in place before being carefully transported for a full autopsy. Initial observations confirmed what experts already suspected: severe dehydration and malnutrition, hyperthermia from the rising temperature inside the sealed home. No signs of external injury, only the slow, agonizing effects of neglect. Forensic specialists determined that Zoe had likely died at least 24 to 36 hours before being found. Her crib sheets, soaked with bodily fluids, indicated she had suffered for days before slipping into unconsciousness. It was a death that didn't happen instantly. It took time, and that was the hardest part for investigators to process. Detectives canvassed the neighborhood, speaking with residents who lived closest to the Jacksons. One neighbor recalled hearing faint crying the first few days, but assumed Zoe was being cared for. Another mentioned seeing the Jacksons' car gone, but didn't think much of it. One of the officers later said, "No one thought a baby had been left alone. No one imagined it." After calling 911, Olivia was brought in for questioning. She repeated Zara's exact words, that Zoe had been left in God's hands. She admitted she didn't believe her daughter was capable of this level of neglect. She was devastated, blaming herself for not checking on Zoe sooner. Her last words to investigators that night were, "I thought she was safe. I thought she was loved." By nightfall, detectives had a clear timeline of events. Zoe was last seen alive on July 1st when her parents left. She had been locked inside for 10 days. She had slowly wasted away, unnoticed by the world. But the case wasn't over. The people responsible for her death were still on another continent. And when they returned, they would have no idea what was waiting for them. On July 12, 2019, after nearly 2 weeks away, Will and Zara Jackson boarded their flight back to Atlanta. To them, the trip had been a success. They had prayed over their future, asking for a new child. They had attended some of the most powerful sermons of their lives. They were coming home feeling spiritually renewed. They had no idea their daughter was already buried in evidence. At Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport, law enforcement had been waiting for them. Detectives coordinated with federal agencies to ensure their arrival wouldn't go unnoticed. As soon as the Jacksons stepped off the plane, officers moved in. At 10:14 a.m., Will and Zara were detained at customs. Eyewitnesses at the airport later described their reactions. Zara froze instantly, her face draining of color. Will remained calm, at first assuming there was some misunderstanding. It wasn't until detectives mentioned Zoe's name that reality seemed to hit them. One officer later said, "It was like watching two people realize their entire world was crumbling in real time." By 11:30 a.m., the couple had been separated for questioning. Zara was visibly shaken, struggling to answer basic questions. Will maintained his composure but repeatedly asked, "What's happening?" When detectives finally told them, both reacted differently. Zara broke down, sobbing uncontrollably. Will sat in silence, staring at the floor. He didn't ask about Zoe. Not once. By 4 p.m., the decision was made. Will and Zara Jackson were formally charged with felony murder, child cruelty, and reckless endangerment. Their bond was denied. They would remain in custody until trial. That night, as they sat in separate holding cells, the weight of their actions finally settled in. For the first time in 10 days, they were alone, just like Zoe had been. The trial of Will and Zara Jackson began in early 2020. The case was not just about the tragic death of a child, but about blind faith turned into reckless neglect. From the moment jury selection began, it was clear that public sentiment was overwhelmingly against them. News outlets had already labeled them as the parents who let God decide their baby's fate. As prosecutors laid out their case, the details were as horrifying as they were heartbreaking. Zoe had been left alone in a locked house for 10 days. No food, no water, no care. Her final moments were spent in agony, while her parents worshipped in another country, praying for a new child. The state argued that Will and Zara had acted with complete disregard for their daughter's life. It wasn't just negligence, it was intentional. Prosecutors brought medical experts to explain how Zoe's death was slow, painful, and entirely preventable. The autopsy photos, shown to the jury, made several jurors visibly emotional. One woman had to excuse herself from the courtroom. When it was time for the defense to speak, their strategy became clear. They would argue that Will and Zara didn't mean for Zoe to die. They were misguided, their attorney said. They truly believed they were leaving their child in God's hands. Zara sat hunched at the defense table, barely looking up. Will, however, remained eerily still, his hands folded neatly in his lap. The most damning testimony came from Olivia, Zara's mother. She had been the one to make the 911 call. She had been the one to demand police check the house. When she took the stand, she did not defend her daughter. She looked at Zara and Will as if she didn't recognize them anymore. "My granddaughter suffered," she said, her voice trembling. "And they let it happen." Public reaction was vicious. Churches distanced themselves from the couple. Even religious leaders who had once preached about faith and miracles condemned their actions. The trial lasted 2 weeks. The jury deliberated for only 4 hours, and when they returned, the verdict was clear. The courtroom was silent as the jury returned. Zara Jackson sat motionless, her hands trembling in her lap. Will kept his eyes forward, showing no emotion. As the judge read the verdict, gasps echoed through the gallery. Guilty, on all counts. Felony murder, child cruelty, reckless endangerment. Zara broke down completely, burying her face in her hands. Will, for the first time since his arrest, let out a heavy, shaking breath. When it was time for the judge to speak, his voice wavered, heavy with emotion. "I have presided over many cases," he said, his eyes glistening, his hands gripping the bench. "But I have never seen such a heartbreaking betrayal of a child's innocence." He looked at them both for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "Perhaps God knew you never needed a child," he finally said. "And that's why she came so late." A quiet sob escaped from one of the jurors. Someone in the courtroom whispered a prayer. The judge's voice shook as he delivered the sentence. Life in prison, without the possibility of parole. Zara collapsed into sobs. Will just closed his eyes. There was no miracle coming for them this time. The trial was over, but the impact of Zoe Jackson's death did not fade. The public remained haunted by the details of the case. People questioned how 2 parents could abandon their child in the name of faith. Zara's mother, Olivia, refused to attend the sentencing. She had already mourned too much. In an interview months later, she admitted, "I lost my daughter the day she left that baby behind." Churches distanced themselves from Will and Zara. The very community that once celebrated them as a model couple now saw them as a symbol of blind, destructive faith. The house where Zoe had died was eventually sold. Neighbors said no one stayed there for long. In prison, Zara became withdrawn, rarely speaking to anyone. According to reports, she spent most of her time reading the Bible. Will, however, was different. Former inmates described him as a man who showed no remorse. One officer reported overhearing him tell another prisoner, "I left it in God's hands." But God never answered, and Zoe never had a choice. Zoe Jackson never got a chance to grow up. Her life was taken, not by violence, but by the people who should have protected her. No child should suffer like this. No one should turn faith into an excuse for cruelty. If stories like this matter to you, if you believe no victim should be forgotten, subscribe to True Crime's Corner. Because justice starts with remembering.